It was the kind of drive that could make a person lose track of time. The Nevada desert, endless and unyielding, stretched out before them in every direction. The hot sun hovered above the horizon, casting long shadows across the cracked earth. Blake had been behind the wheel for what felt like hours, his hands gripping the steering wheel as the road seemed to go on forever, a long ribbon of asphalt cutting through the desolate landscape. The car's engine hummed steadily, but it was the only sound that seemed to break the silence. "Man, this place is a wasteland," Mark said from the back seat, his voice breaking the quiet. He had his arm draped over the window, looking out at the barren scenery. He seemed restless, shifting in his seat and glancing at the map in his hands every now and then. "How much longer until we hit that town?" Blake glanced at the GPS, his eyes narrowing. "We should be close. Maybe another 30 minutes. Jenna, sitting in the front passenger seat, let out a sigh. "I still don't get why we're doing this. Why would anyone want to visit some old ghost town in the middle of nowhere?" Blake shrugged. "It's an adventure. Something different. You know? Besides, we've been talking about checking out weird places for a while. This could be cool." Sarah, in the back with Mark, added, "It's kind of like our own little urban exploration trip. Think of the photos I could take. Abandoned places always have this creepy charm to them." Mark raised an eyebrow, leaning forward to look at her. "You and your photos. Are you trying to turn this into some Instagram challenge?" Sarah laughed, pulling her phone from her bag and tapping the screen. "Well, the world needs to see what kind of adventures I get up to." She flicked her blonde hair behind her ear. "Besides, who wouldn't want to see a forgotten Nevada town? These places have history, and weird stuff happens in history. Blake couldn't help but chuckle at Sarah's enthusiasm. "All right, but remember, no ghost hunting crap when we get there. Let's just look around, take some pictures, and head out." As they continued on, the landscape began to change subtly. The cracked earth gave way to rocky outcroppings, and the sparse vegetation grew even more sparse. The few abandoned houses and structures they passed by were half buried in sand, and the air was thick with the dry heat. It was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still, as if the world had forgotten about it entirely. Finally, the car crested a small hill, and in the distance, a silhouette appeared. A town, or what was left of it. The buildings were weathered, some with their roofs caving in, others missing entire walls. There was no movement, no sign of life, just a ghostly presence in the middle of the desert. Blake's foot eased off the gas pedal as he slowed the car, taking in the view. The town looked like something out of an old Western movie. Abandoned, forgotten, and left to decay. "There it is," Blake said, his voice quieter now, as the reality of what they were looking at set in. They reached the town's edge and pulled up near a broken-down welcome sign that was half buried in the sand. It was so faded that it was hard to make out the name, but the letters that remained were enough to know this wasn't a place people had visited in decades. The windows of the car rolled down, and a gust of warm desert wind blew in, carrying with it a strange scent, stale air mixed with dust, and something else that Blake couldn't quite place. "Well, this is something," Mark said, looking out the window. "Kinda creepy." Sarah, eager as ever, was already unbuckling her seatbelt. "I think it's amazing. This is perfect for photos." Jenna hesitated. "It's so quiet, like unnervingly quiet." Blake looked over at her. "It's a ghost town. What did you expect?" Mark threw open his door and stepped out, the dry heat hitting him immediately. The town looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. There were old cars left in the streets, buildings half collapsed, and rusting metal everywhere. He looked around, his eyes squinting against the fading light. "This place feels off," he muttered, the unease creeping into his voice. "Come on, don't be so dramatic," Blake said, stepping out of the car. "It's just old, nothing weird about it." Sarah, already taking photos, didn't seem fazed. "I think it's beautiful in its own way, kind of eerie, but in a cool way." She tilted her camera up and snapped a shot of an old, crooked sign that hung above what used to be a diner. But as she stepped closer to the diner, her smile faded. Something caught her eye. A dark stain on the ground, just in front of the door. At first glance, it looked like just a patch of dirt. But as she knelt down, she could see the deep crimson color. "Hey guys, check this out," Sarah called out, her voice suddenly tremulous. Blake, Jenna, and Mark turned toward her, their footsteps crunching on the dry ground as they made their way over. As they got closer, it was clear that the stain wasn't just dirt. It was dried blood, thick, congealed blood, as though something or someone had been dragged across the ground. Sarah looked around, her eyes wide, as she stood up slowly. The eerie silence of the place seemed to grow louder, the air heavier. That's blood, right?" Jenna whispered, her hand over her mouth as she stared at the stain. Blake frowned. "Yeah, it looks like it." He stepped back, his gaze flicking to the cracked windows of the diner. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in years. No signs of a recent struggle, just that unsettling stain. But as he was about to speak, a low growl interrupted him. The sound came from the shadows of the alleyway to their left, a guttural, inhuman noise. It was distant at first, but as it lingered, It grew louder. A shiver ran down Blake's spine. The others heard it too, their eyes darting toward the alley, as if hoping it was just the wind or some animal. But the growl came again, much closer this time. "What the hell is that?" Mark asked, his voice tight with fear. Blake stepped forward, scanning the darkening street. There was no movement, no animals, no people, just the sound, like something was creeping toward them. The growl came again, now much closer, followed by the unmistakable sound of shuffling footsteps. Blake's stomach twisted as he turned to the others, the unease now bubbling into full-blown fear. "Get in the car, now," Blake ordered, but it was too late. From the shadows, a figure emerged, its form hunched and shuffling forward with unnatural speed. The skin was gray and decayed, the eyes completely white and blank. Its mouth hung open, dripping with dark, viscous fluid. "Run!" Blake shouted. But before they could react, the thing lunged at them, growling and snarling with terrifying hunger. Blake's heart raced as the adrenaline kicked in. His eyes locked on the others. "Move!" "Shout!" Blake shouted. Before they could react, the thing lunged at them, growling and snarling with terrifying hunger. Blake's heart raced as the adrenaline kicked in. His eyes locked on the others. "Move!" "And shout!" Blake shouted. But before they could react, the thing lunged at them, growling and snarling with terrifying hunger. Blake's heart raced as the adrenaline kicked in. His eyes locked on the others. A figure lunged at them, growling and snarling with terrifying hunger. Blake's heart raced as the adrenaline kicked in. His eyes locked on the others. Now! The town was no longer silent. It was alive with danger, and the nightmare had just begun. The growl was unlike anything they had ever heard before. A deep, guttural sound that seemed to rise from the very bowels of the earth. Blake's stomach tightened, and his heart began to pound in his chest as the noise echoed through the still air. It wasn't just some stray animal. No, this was something far worse, something unnatural. The group froze, each of them turning slowly to locate the source of the sound. Blake was the first to spot it. At the far edge of the street, just beyond the shadow of the crumbling diner, there was a figure. The thing stood hunched over, its body twisted in a grotesque fashion. Its clothes, once probably a faded denim jacket and torn jeans, hung in tatters from its emaciated body. The skin was pale, almost gray, stretched thin over what remained of its skeletal frame. The face was the worst part. Hollow eyes that stared out into nothingness. Wide open, and completely white, with no pupils to speak of. Its mouth hung open, lips cracked and torn, dripping with something thick and dark. Blake's breath hitched. It wasn't water, and it sure as hell wasn't saliva. Whatever it was thick and sticky. Definitely not normal. Is that a person? Jenna's voice was a quiet whisper, full of disbelief. Blake felt his skin crawl as he tried to process what he was seeing. His mind screamed at him that it couldn't be true, that this was just some strange illusion or a prank. But deep down, he knew this wasn't a joke. The way the figure moved, its jerky, unnatural steps, confirmed it. This was something else. Something terrifying. Before anyone could respond, the figure jerked its head toward them, its mouth opening wider. And then it moved. It wasn't slow or hesitant like Blake expected. It was fast, unnervingly fast for something so decrepit. In one terrifying motion, the creature lunged forward, its limbs stretching and extending with an unnatural speed. It wasn't a shuffle. It wasn't a stumble. It was a sprint. Mark screamed. It happened so quickly that Blake couldn't fully process it until he heard Mark's scream rip through the night air, raw and full of terror. The thing had reached Mark before any of them could react, its hands grabbing hold of his shoulders and pulling him down to the ground. Mark tried to fight back, his legs kicking and flailing, but the creature was too strong. With a horrific snarl, it sunk its teeth deep into Mark's shoulder, tearing through the fabric of his jacket and into his flesh. Blake's mind spun. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. All he could do was watch as the creature fed on Mark, its teeth digging in further, blood pooling in the dirt beneath them. The sound of flesh being ripped apart was sickening. Wet, squelching noises that made Blake's stomach churn. "Mark," Blake shouted, his voice breaking through the shock. He reached out, his hands grabbing at Mark's arms, pulling with everything he had. But the thing didn't let go. Its grip was iron, and its strength seemed to double as it sank its teeth deeper into Mark's flesh. "No!" Jenna screamed, her face pale with fear. She ran forward, but Blake stopped her, grabbing her wrist and pulling her back. "We have to get out of here," Blake shouted, his eyes frantic as he looked around. More of them were coming. He could hear their growls, see the dark shapes emerging from the shadows of the abandoned buildings. There were more, so many more. Mark's body twitched beneath the creature, his legs kicking weakly, but his movements were growing sluggish. The blood that poured from the wound in his shoulder was dark, pooling around him like a macabre river. Blake's heart sank. Mark wasn't going to make it. He could see it in his friend's eyes. The life was leaving him. With a final, desperate pull, Blake yanked Mark free from the creature's grasp. Mark's body was limp, his head lolling to the side, his breath shallow and ragged. Blake's hands were covered in his friend's blood, his skin slick with the crimson mess. But there was no time to process the horror. They were running out of time. Jenna was already backing away, her eyes wide with terror, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. Sarah was right beside her, her face ashen and stricken with fear. The screams echoed through the empty streets, but Blake didn't care. There was only one thing on his mind now: survival. "We need to leave now," Blake shouted, turning and pushing Sarah and Jenna toward the car. His legs were heavy, his body trembling, but he couldn't stop. His heart pounded in his ears as he sprinted for the vehicle. But when they reached the car, Blake realized they were not alone. The streets had come alive with movement. Figures were emerging from every corner of the town, their pale, lifeless eyes fixed on the group. There was no escaping them now. The zombies were everywhere, at least a dozen, maybe more. They staggered out from the shadows, from behind collapsed walls, from the alleyways. Their movements were jerky, their bodies disfigured and sickly. Some were dragging themselves along the ground, while others walked upright, their hands reaching out like they were hungry for more. Blake's stomach churned as he saw the grotesque forms of his former neighbors, or at least what used to be people. He could see it in their faces. If there were any humanity left in them, it was long gone. Only hunger remained. Jenna grabbed Blake's arm, her fingers trembling. "Blake, what do we do?" Blake didn't answer right away. He was trying to think. He was trying to breathe. He needed to think fast. "There's no time," Blake muttered. He scanned the area, looking for any way out. They couldn't fight them off. Not like this. Not without weapons. And even if they could fight back, how could they? These things, these monsters, had the advantage of numbers, speed, and strength. They couldn't take them all on. "Get in the car!" Blake shouted again, his voice shaking but urgent. "Get in! Now!" Mark's body was still lying in the street, a lifeless, bloodied heap. Blake could feel the weight of his friend's death settle heavily in his chest, but there was no time to mourn. There was no time to think about anything other than escaping. Jenna was the first to get in, slamming the door behind her. Sarah followed quickly, and Blake jumped into the driver's seat. His hands fumbled for the keys, his breath shallow and fast. His heart was still racing, but his mind was locked in survival mode. He turned the ignition, but the engine sputtered. "Come on, come on," Blake muttered, his voice barely a whisper as he pumped the gas. But the car didn't start. The zombies were getting closer. Their growls were growing louder, their snarls more frenzied. The car was useless. Blake's eyes shot to the rearview mirror. More of them were behind them now, too. They were surrounded. "Shit," Blake cursed, pulling his foot off the gas and throwing the car into reverse. The wheels spun, kicking up dust, but the car didn't move. They were stuck. "We're not going to make it," Jenna cried, her voice rising in panic. Blake gritted his teeth, his mind racing for any escape route. There was none. They were trapped. The growls and screams were closing in fast, and Blake knew that it was only a matter of time before the zombies reached them. The fight for survival had just begun. The sound of their frantic footsteps echoed through the streets of the abandoned town, growing louder and more desperate with each passing second. Blake's breath came in ragged gasps, his lungs burning as he pushed himself harder, pulling Jenna and Sarah along with him. He could hear the others behind them, Mark stumbling in his wake. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat sending a jolt of adrenaline through his body. The terrifying noise, the snarls, growls, and guttural sounds of the undead was growing louder. The town was alive with death, and it was closing in. Blake risked a quick glance over his shoulder, but what he saw made his blood run cold. More of them, so many more. Their pale, ashen faces twisted in grotesque, hungry expressions, their white eyes locked onto the group. Their slow, staggering movements were now turning into something more urgent, more aggressive. They were following them. No, they were hunting them. "Come on, come on," Blake shouted, his voice raw with panic. His legs were burning from the exertion, and his breath felt too shallow, but he didn't stop. They couldn't stop. They had to keep moving, had to find somewhere, anywhere, to escape. They darted into a narrow alley, the sound of their feet crunching against the scattered debris and cracked pavement, almost drowned out by the growls from behind them. The alley was filled with the scent of rot and decay. The air thick and oppressive. Blake could feel the weight of it pressing against him, but there was no time to worry about the air. They had to keep running. He risked another glance back and saw that the first of the zombies was gaining on them, its hands reaching out like claws. Sarah's breath was coming in quick bursts, her face pale with fear. "What the hell is going on?" she cried out, her voice trembling. Blake didn't have the time or the words to explain. He didn't know what was happening. All he knew was that the town had become a death trap, something you watched in horror films. late at night. Not something that existed in the real world. But now, here they were, chasing them down, hungry and relentless. The alley opened up into a larger street, and for a moment, Blake thought they might have lost the horde. The street was littered with more abandoned cars, some with shattered windows, others parked at odd angles, as though people had fled in a hurry. The street was packed with zombies. The entire road was crowded with them, shuffling and stumbling in their direction. The way they moved, so stiff and unnatural, made Blake's stomach churn. But what really made his heart stop was the sheer number of them. There were so many, far more than he had imagined, and they were getting closer. No, 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 Blake muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. His mind raced, trying to come up with a plan, some way out of this nightmare. He scanned the street, but there was no clear escape. The zombies were everywhere. Sarah clung to Blake's arm, her grip tight and frantic. She was terrified, her eyes wide with panic. "What do we do?" she gasped, her voice cracking. "We can't just fight them all. We're not going to make it." Blake's gaze flicked between the horde and his friends. They had no weapons, no way to defend themselves. Blake turned to Mark, who was trailing behind them. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unfocused, his body jerking with each step. The once vibrant spark in his eyes was gone. It was replaced by a vacant, glassy stare. Blake's heart sank. "Mark, no," he whispered under his breath, his stomach twisting with dread. He wanted to believe there was still hope for his friend, that Mark would snap out of whatever this was. But the truth was undeniable. Mark wasn't Mark anymore. He wasn't human. Blake stopped dead in his tracks. He watched as Mark's body began to stiffen, his hands twitching at his sides. There was a horrible, sickening sound, like a deep, rasping growl coming from deep within Mark's chest. Blake's breath caught in his throat as Mark's head jerked toward him, his eyes now completely white. There was no recognition in them, no hint of the friend Blake had known just hours ago. Mark's body went rigid, his movements jerking and twitching, like a puppet on broken strings. It was too late. Mark's mouth hung open, an unnatural snarl escaping from his throat. He didn't speak, didn't try to fight the transformation. He just stood there, trembling, his body already beginning to rot from the inside out. Blake's blood ran cold as he realized that Mark had become one of them. He had become a zombie. The scream that escaped from Jenna's mouth shattered the silence, her eyes filling with terror as she looked at Mark's transformation. Blake's hands trembled as he reached out, his chest tightening with a wave of helplessness. Mark was gone. There was nothing they could do for him, but there was no time to mourn. The zombies were closing in. The others were coming. They were already here. Blake spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. "Run!" he screamed, his voice raw and desperate. There was no plan anymore, no strategy, just survival. They had to get out of here. They had to run, and they had to run now. The group turned and bolted, sprinting toward the nearest car. Their feet pounded against the cracked pavement, their bodies burning from the effort. Every step felt like it might be their last, the dread crawling up their spines as the sound of the undead grew louder, closer. Blake didn't dare look back. He could hear the slapping footsteps of the zombies following them, their shuffling pace gaining ground with every moment. His breath was coming in sharp gasps now, his legs threatening to give way beneath him. The fear and exhaustion made it almost impossible to think. But he pushed on, praying to whatever gods might listen, that they would make it out alive. They reached the car, but the moment Blake's hand grasped the door handle, he realized something that made his heart sink even lower. The car was surrounded. The undead had closed in, and there was no way to get in and drive away. Blake's mind raced, desperately searching for a solution, but there was nothing. The car was trapped. They were trapped. The first of the zombies reached them, its outstretched hands slamming against the side of the car. It was just a matter of time before they would be overrun. The group was cornered. The only way out now was through the horde. But how could they possibly make it? "Blake," Sarah screamed, pulling at his arm, her eyes wide with panic. "What do we do?" Blake's mind was a blur, but one thought repeated over and over: survival. The house was old, abandoned and decaying, just like the town that surrounded it. Blake pushed the door shut behind him with trembling hands, the sound of it locking echoing like a death sentence. His eyes darted nervously as he glanced at the others. They were all panting, gasping for breath, but there was no time to rest. The undead were still out there, their growls and groans lingering in the air like a dark cloud. Blake's heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat, but he tried to steady himself, fighting the rising panic that threatened to swallow him whole. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his mind. They had to think clearly if they were going to survive. But the fear that had gripped him ever since they'd arrived in this cursed town had only grown stronger. He could still hear the screams of their friend, Mark, as he had turned. Was turned, and Blake had been helpless to do anything about it. The others were just as shaken, their faces pale with terror. Jenna was still trembling, her hands wiping away the tears that streaked down her face. Sarah was wide-eyed, her lips pressed together in a thin line, trying to hold back her own panic. Blake's eyes scanned the room, taking in the old furniture, the cracked windows, and the thick layers of dust that covered every surface. The house had clearly been abandoned for years. It was a relic from another time, a place frozen in time, with nothing left but memories and whispers of a dark past. "We have to stay quiet," Blake said, his voice hoarse. He kept his tone low but firm, trying to reassure his friends. "We can't let them hear us." Jenna nodded, her eyes darting toward the window. The wind was howling outside, and the sound of it seemed to make the house feel even colder. They huddled together in the center of the room, their breaths shallow and quick. Blake's mind raced, trying to come up with a plan, but there was no escaping the fact that they were trapped. The zombies outside weren't going away. In fact, the longer they stayed here, the more dangerous it became. Blake couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this place. Something dark and sinister had happened here, and it wasn't just a random outbreak. The zombies weren't just people who'd been infected. They were part of something bigger, something far more terrifying. As Blake's eyes scanned the room, his gaze landed on the walls. He froze. Something wasn't right. On the wooden planks that lined the walls, there were strange symbols, red, faded, and eerily familiar. They were scratched into the wood, some almost appearing to have been etched by nails or some sharp object. The symbols looked almost like a ritualistic marking, something that belonged in an ancient text or a forbidden book. His stomach turned as he stepped closer to get a better look. There were so many of them, twisting and looping into patterns that made no sense. "What the hell are these?" Blake murmured under his breath, his heart racing. Jenna, who had been sitting quietly, looked up and followed his gaze. She frowned, then slowly stood up. "They look like symbols," she said, her voice
barely a whisper, but I've never seen anything like them.
Blake ran his fingers over one of the markings. It was rough to the touch, the wood underneath splintering where the symbol had been carved. He shivered, a sense of dread creeping down his spine. He knew something was wrong with this place. But now, standing here in the dusty room, with the strange symbols surrounding them, the reality of the situation hit him harder than before. "These aren't just random marks," Blake said, his voice low and grim. "They're part of something that happened here. Something bad." Jenna took a step forward, her eyes widening in fear. "What do you mean? What happened here?" Blake didn't answer right away. He stood there, staring at the symbols for a moment longer, trying to make sense of it all. The air in the room felt heavier now, like it was pressing down on them. He knew the answers were somewhere in this house, somewhere in this forsaken town. Blake moved quickly across the room, his eyes scanning the dusty shelves and tables. He opened a drawer, hoping to find something, anything, that could give him an explanation. The drawer was filled with old papers, yellowed and brittle with age. He pulled them out one by one, flipping through them until a particular piece of paper caught his eye. It was a newspaper article, crinkled and torn at the edges, but still readable. Blake's breath caught in his throat as he read the headline, "Nevada town struck by mysterious virus. All residents turned into zombies." A word seems to blur for a moment, but Blake forced himself to focus. The date on the article was from 1978, over 4 decades ago. The headline was chilling enough on its own, but it was the rest of the article that made his blood run cold. According to the article, the entire town had been ravaged by an unknown virus. People had started showing signs of aggression and madness, their bodies deteriorating rapidly, and within a matter of days, the entire population had turned into the undead. The article spoke of failed attempts by the government to contain the outbreak, but in the end, the town had been quarantined, sealed off from the rest of the world. Blake's hands trembled as he continued reading. The more he read, the more his stomach churned. The article suggested that the virus wasn't the only problem in the town. There was something else at play here. Some sort of ritualistic event had occurred just before the outbreak. Something dark and forbidden. The virus, it seemed, wasn't the natural cause of the zombie transformation. It was the result of something far more sinister. The symbols on the walls The ones Blake had seen earlier were a part of the ritual that had triggered the virus. "This isn't just a random attack," Blake muttered, more to himself than anyone else. He dropped the article in his lap, his mind racing. This place, there's something here. Something that made them all like this. Jenna, who had been sitting quietly beside him, looked up. Her face was pale, and her lips were trembling. "What do you mean? What happened here?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Blake stared at the article for a long moment, his mind trying to process the horrifying implications of what he was reading. He finally looked up at Jenna and Sarah, his face grim. "This town, it's cursed. Whatever it was, it turned everyone here into the Walking Dead. We're stuck in the middle of it now." Sarah, who had been standing by the window, turned slowly toward him. Her eyes were wide with disbelief. "A curse? Are you serious?" Blake stood up, feeling the weight of the revelation settle in his chest. "Look at the symbols," he said, pointing to the walls. "This place is filled with them. These aren't just markings. This is some sort of ritual. They did something here, something that caused this virus, this outbreak, and now we're part of it." The room fell silent as the words sank in. Jenna and Sarah exchanged uneasy glances, the fear in their eyes growing with every word Blake spoke. The weight of the situation was becoming too much to bear, and it was only just beginning to dawn on them that they might never leave this town alive. Outside, the wind howled again, the sound eerily similar to the moans and growls of the undead. Blake could almost feel their presence, lurking just beyond the walls, waiting for the right moment to strike. Whatever had happened here, whatever dark force had turned this town into a wasteland of the dead, it wasn't over. They were part of it now, trapped in the middle of a nightmare with no way out. The house that had offered them a brief moment of refuge was beginning to feel more like a prison than a sanctuary. Blake could hear the sound of shuffling feet outside, echoing through the quiet streets like a sinister drumbeat. The zombies were out there, searching for them, their grotesque figures staggering through the shadows of the abandoned town. Blake could hear their growls and raspy breaths. And it didn't take long to realize that the brief calm they'd experienced was already over. The nightmare had returned, and now they were running out of time. The air in the house felt thick, heavy with fear and the suffocating realization that there was no escape. Blake could feel the weight of his own breath pressing against his chest. They couldn't stay hidden forever. The horde would eventually find them, And once they did, there would be no more hiding, no more chances to run. Their only option was to leave now. But there was one huge problem. Getting out of the house meant passing through the heart of the horde. Blake paced back and forth in the cramped living room, his mind racing for a plan. Jenna, Sarah, and even Mark, now a zombie, had been the ones Blake had tried to protect. And yet here they were, cornered in an abandoned house with nowhere to turn. He wiped the sweat off his brow and glanced nervously out the window. The wind outside had picked up, and the once quiet streets were filled with the horrible sound of undead groans, a noise that's... "We can't outrun them," Jenna said, her voice trembling as she stood in the corner, staring out through the cracked window. Her face was pale, and her eyes were wide with fear. "We're trapped. There's no way out. What are we supposed to do?" Blake could hear the panic in her voice, and it made his stomach knot. He turned to look at her, trying to keep his own fear in check as he spoke. "We don't have to outrun them," he said, his voice firm, though there was a trace of uncertainty in his words. "We just need to outsmart them." Jenna looked up at him, her expression confused. "Outsmart them?" she echoed. "How do we outsmart that?" She gestured wildly toward the sound of the approaching horde, as if the idea of outsmarting them was impossible. Blake didn't have time to explain the strategy in detail. The truth was, he wasn't entirely sure himself how they would outsmart them, but there was no other choice. His mind was spinning, but he clung to the idea that there had to be a way to survive this. They'd been lucky so far, but luck wasn't going to save them now. He quickly turned and motioned for the others to follow him. "Come on," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "We're getting out of here now." A group moved cautiously toward the back of the house, where Blake had noticed an old, rusted truck parked behind a dilapidated garage. The truck was ancient, covered in dust and dirt, but it was their best shot. They had to get out of the town, and fast. If they could start the engine and get on the road, they might have a chance to make it to safety. Blake approached the truck, his hands shaking as he tried the door. It creaked open with a loud protest. But when he slid into the driver's seat and turned the key in the ignition, the engine roared to life with a surprisingly loud noise, as though the truck itself had been waiting to come alive. For a moment, the group just stood there, breathless, staring at the dashboard as the engine rumbled beneath them. For a brief second, it seemed like they were free from the terror that had gripped them. Blake's heart leapt in his chest as he put the truck in gear and slammed his foot on the gas. The tires screeched as the truck lurched forward, kicking up dust and debris as it raced toward the exit of the town. They sped down the cracked, empty streets, the truck bouncing as it hit potholes and uneven pavement. Blake's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles white, his focus solely on the road ahead. He couldn't afford to look back. They had a small window of time to escape, and he wasn't about to waste it. "Go! Go! Go!" Jenna yelled, her voice desperate. She was clinging to the seat, her body pressed against the back of the truck. Sarah was beside her, wide-eyed and silent, her face pale as she stared ahead. Blake pushed the truck faster, the engine roaring as they sped through the deserted streets. He could see the outskirts of the town ahead, the last stretch of road before they would break free into the vast desert. The end was in sight. He could almost taste the relief, feel the weight lifting from his chest. But then, something terrible happened. The truck sputtered. Blake's heart sank. The sound of the engine faltering sent a cold shiver down his spine. He slammed his foot on the gas, but the truck only jerked forward a few more feet before stalling completely. The engine sputtered and died, leaving them motionless in the middle of the road. "No! No, no, no!" Blake shouted, his hands flying to the wheel as he tried to restart the engine. He twisted the key over and over, but the truck wouldn't start. It was dead, and with every second that passed, the sound of the zombies grew louder, their raspy growls and shrieks echoing through the deserted streets. They were closing in. Blake slammed his fist against the steering wheel in frustration. This couldn't be happening. They had been so close. They had almost made it. "Blake!" Jenna screamed, her voice filled with panic. "What are we going to do now?" Blake didn't answer at first. He had no plan, no idea what to do. He was stuck, trapped in the middle of the town, surrounded by death. His mind raced as he glanced around. The zombies were getting closer, their staggering, uncoordinated steps increasing in speed. He could see them now, coming into view at the far end of the road. "We have to go," Blake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We have to run. Now." Without another word, he threw open the truck door and jumped out. Jenna and Sarah followed quickly, stumbling as they ran toward the open desert. There was no other choice. They had to make it to the mountains, just ahead in the distance. Blake didn't know if they would make it, but it was their only chance. The thought of being surrounded by the horde, of becoming like Mark, made Blake's stomach twist in terror. They ran, feet pounding against the cracked earth, adrenaline surging through their veins. The desert stretched out before them, vast and empty. But the mountains loomed in the distance, high and jagged, a possible escape from the chaos. But they weren't alone. Behind them, the sound of the undead grew louder, their growls turning into shrieks The horde was closing in, and Blake knew that time was running out. They were no longer running from a single threat. They were running for their lives, away from an army of the undead. "We can't stop," Blake gasped, his voice barely audible as he pushed himself harder. The weight of fear settled in his chest. They had no choice but to keep going, to keep surviving. And so they ran, with only the mountains in sight and death hot on their heels. A Nevada desert stretched endlessly before them, the dry, cracked earth beneath their feet, burning with each step. Blake's legs were like lead, his body aching, his breath ragged as they ran. The air felt thick, heavy, and each inhale felt like he was sucking in dust and heat. A constant reminder of how far they'd come, and how close they were to the end. But the end wasn't a place. It was the horrors that lurked behind them. The zombies were still coming, and they were relentless. Blake glanced over at Sarah, her face pale, her eyes wild with fear. Her steps were slowing, her breath coming in sharp gasps. But she kept running. They both did, driven by the need to survive. But every second that ticked by felt like a ticking clock, counting down to the moment when it would all be over. The distant howls of the undead were growing louder, closer. The shuffle. Blake's heart was pounding so loudly he could barely hear anything else, but the sound of the growls and the rustling behind them was unmistakable. The night had become an oppressive thing, dark, suffocating, and filled with the terror that only the undead could bring. The ground beneath them was uneven, the rocks and sharp bits of desert debris tearing at their shoes as they stumbled forward. "Come on," Blake shouted, his voice hoarse, barely able to rise above the cacophony of sounds around them. "We have to keep going." Sarah, her face streaked with sweat and dirt, nodded weakly, but there was no real strength left in her. Her body was barely able to keep up with the pace, and Blake could see it in her eyes. She was running on pure fear, no longer sure of what came next, but determined to survive. Behind them, the shrieks of the zombies rose in pitch, a chorus of death that sent a jolt of panic through Blake's chest. He dared not look back, knowing that each glance behind them was a wasted second they couldn't afford. But the sound of their growls, mixed with the clattering of bones and the eerie silence of the desert, was enough to drive any person mad with fear. And then, as if it was the final act in their desperate escape, it happened. Jenna, who had been struggling to keep up, stumbled, her foot caught on a rock hidden beneath the shifting desert sand, and she fell forward onto the dry earth. The sound of her fall echoed in Blake's ears, a sharp thud that felt like a hammer to his chest. "Jenna," Blake shouted, his heart sinking as he turned around. But before he could reach her, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of the zombies closing in. Their growls were now a full chorus, swelling in the air as they caught the scent of fresh flesh. Jenna's scream ripped through the night, high-pitched and full of agony as the creatures dragged her into the darkness of the desert. "Jenna!" Blake cried out again, his voice breaking, but it was useless. Her screams were swallowed by the sound of the undead. The night seemed to consume her, the fear and panic leaving Blake in a momentary paralysis as he watched her disappear into the shadows. Sarah stumbled to a stop beside Blake, her face ashen, her breath shallow as she gasped for air. She was trembling now, her eyes darting nervously over her shoulder, as if expecting the zombies to appear at any second. "We have to go," Blake urged, his voice hoarse from the rawness of his own fear. But there was no time to mourn Jenna. There was no time to process what had just happened. The zombies were closing in fast, and if they stopped, they would join Jenna in the darkness. Blake grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her forward, forcing her to run, even though she could barely stand. Her legs were giving out, and Blake could feel the weight of their shared exhaustion dragging them both down. But they couldn't stop. Not now. Not when the mountain was in sight. It was their only chance. They pressed on, their steps faltering but steady, their feet finding purchase on the rocky desert ground as the faint outline of the mountains loomed ahead. The peaks were jagged against the dark sky, distant but clear, just within reach, but not yet attainable. Blake could see the outline of cliffs and the start of a narrow trail that led up into the rocky terrain. It was their only shot, their only hope. But as they neared the base of the mountains, Blake risked a glance behind him. His heart sank as he saw the horde. A sea of them, shuffling toward them with a terrifying persistence. He could make out their twisted faces, pale, bloated, their eyes wide and unseeing, mouths gaping with hunger. It was as though the entire town had been emptied into the desert to hunt them down. Blake's legs burned with exhaustion, but the sight of the approaching monsters fueled him forward. He pushed Sarah ahead of him, his mind calculating the distance between them and the mountains. Could they make it? Would they survive long enough to reach the safety of the rocks, or would they fall just short of the climb? Every second felt like an eternity. His chest heaved with the weight of the fear and the physical toll the running had taken on him. His muscles screamed in protest, and his mind was starting to falter from the exhaustion. But he kept his eyes on the mountain, his one hope. They reached the base of the mountain, where the rocky trail started to ascend into the darker shadows of the cliffs. Blake's legs felt like jelly as he began to climb, but he had to keep going. There was no other choice. Sarah followed, struggling but determined. The sound of the zombies was still there, the guttural growls and the horrible dragging of their feet, but they were farther behind now, too far to catch up if they reached the safety of the cliffs. At least, that's what Blake told himself. But even as they climbed, he could feel his strength slipping. The weight of their desperate escape was wearing him down, and he could feel the gnawing panic creeping in. Would they really make it? Would they get far enough into the mountains to escape? They reached a small plateau near the top, where Blake collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. Sarah stumbled beside him, her legs shaking as she leaned against the rock wall. Her face was streaked with dirt, sweat, and tears, and her eyes were wide, haunted. Blake looked out over the desert, his eyes straining to see anything in the darkness. He could still hear the faint sounds of the zombies below, but they were fading now, further away, their moans swallowed by the vast expanse of the desert. "We made it," Sarah whispered, her voice a weak, breathless echo. But as the words left her lips, Blake's eyes locked onto something in the distance. Something that made his heart stop. The town. It was visible now, from where they sat, looking like a forsaken ghost in the distance. It was empty now, the streets silent. But the zombies were still out there, roaming the streets, a constant presence in the town. Blake's stomach churned with a realization. The town wasn't just haunted by the undead. It was cursed. Blake's heart sank as he looked at Sarah. There's no escaping it, is there? Sarah looked back at him, her eyes empty, her lips trembling. No. It's never going to end, is it? Blake felt a chill settle deep in his bones as he gazed back toward the mountain path, then at the empty town below. He finally understood. This wasn't just a virus or a random outbreak. This was something older, something more malevolent. A curse that had claimed the town long ago, and now it had claimed them too. And somewhere, deep in the shadows of the desert, the undead were still out there, waiting, watching. The curse of Nevada's hidden towns had no end. The end. Or was it?